All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Kitz. I'm a consultant for Petrolern through my company, Kitz Works. And today we're going to be talking about a geothermal battery, synthetic geothermal reservoir. There's a lot of different names for it, but the basic idea is to create a artificial geothermal reservoir, subsurface impermeable sandstones, and then to be able to recover that heat later as a to a conventional or semi-conventional geothermal power plant. I have 35 years of experience in the geothermal power industry, and I've worked on a lot of technology innovation ideas in collaboration with a lot of really skilled people. And happy to give some ideas here about this idea. I think the idea of a synthetic geothermal reservoir is really a good fit for the oil and gas industry because it, in a way that no other renewable energy can, it brings together all of their core technical competencies: rapid, low-cost drilling, subsurface management, geology, geophysics, all the geosciences. And couples it with a decarbonized energy solution. And so I think it's a really good fit. Often I hear that geothermal is not competitive with solar and wind. And I'm going to go into a little bit later why that is, some of the fundamental errors in that kind of thinking. But I'm going to start with what I hope is a little bit of a humorous version of that. Well, there we go. Is that full screen now? Just nod. Okay. So let's understand the difference between variable renewable energy, wind and solar, versus a classic baseload or dispatchable baseload like geothermal. And we're going to do it to an analogy of a table saw. So here is a geothermal table saw. It has a lot of features. Sure, it cuts wood, but it has a lot of grid attributes beyond that. I'd now like to share with you the VRE version of a table saw. PV, yeah, it does something. And when you put it with a battery, it does a little bit more, but it does not do the same thing on the grid that a geothermal power plant does. 24/7, all weather. You know, it's a much different analogy, and we'll see a little bit later on why that is. That in a little bit more detail. So that's just a little bit of background about why geothermal matters. So let's go on to the geothermal battery now. And so this was from an ARPA-E proposal that Petrolern put together. It's actually got quite a history. This is just the groups that I've been involved in this concept. There's many others. And so I'm only going to be presenting the things that I've worked on. There's much greater depth to this topic area than this alone. So the right question. If it's not the right question, you're not going to get the right answer. And this is really important to start with on something as expensive and complicated as a geothermal battery. And so, you know, this is also a recycled slide. So what's the best vehicle? Well, I mean, is it the fastest? Is it the most comfortable, most miles per liter? Or is what we're really trying to ask is what's the least CO2 per passenger kilometer? So the way you ask the question is going to determine the answer that you get. And so in new grid connected technologies, what is that right question, and what's the wrong question? So we'll start with the wrong question is what's the LCOE? What's the dollars per megawatt hour that this technology can deliver? The right question is what's the cheapest way to remove the next 1,000, 100 gigatons of CO2 from the grid, because that's really what the objective is. The objective is not dollars per megawatt hour. The objective is to get rid of CO2 on the grid, because if we're asking about dollars per megawatt hour, then natural gas is the cheapest in most countries. So we have to start with the right question. We're shooting for decarbonization. And so now if we look at that question, what's the versus the question about CO2 on the grid versus LCOE, you can see the big difference between geothermal and VREs, here represented by photovoltaics PV. So geothermal has an LCOE of, let's say, 80, and PV has an LCOE of anywhere from 20 to 30, more and more often at 20. But then you have to add a battery at a capital cost of $250 a kilowatt for $250 a megawatt for a 4-hour battery. And then you have to back that up with a gas turbine at 70, and versus the geothermal power plant that does all of that for its 80. Both are delivering to the grid. There's also in geothermal a lot of room for cascade industries and a lot more jobs. Well, the promise of the green, one of the promises of the green economy is more jobs in green energy. And so there's very, very few jobs in either in building or operating photovoltaic plants or wind plants. There's far more jobs, especially in cascade industries and in support industries in geothermal. And that economic benefit isn't even calculated in any of this. So again, the right question is important, and a holistic view is really what that's all about. So what are the energy needs of the grid? So decarbonization. We have to be able to ramp at sunset to cover PV. We have to have all-night generation. We have to have 24/7 generation. We need to figure out a way to do seasonal storage of surplus. Now, it is inevitable that in a decarbonized grid, we are going to have surplus energy. You know, it's all of those things that are listed there. And the reason it's inevitable is that the load on the grid changes. So if you want to be able to meet a high demand period with renewables, it means that in a low demand period, you're going to have too many renewables. That's just intrinsic. So there will be surplus. So we're going to have to figure out basically how to adjust load to meet the generation. Now, this is a completely flipped on its head perspective from our current grid, which is we instantaneously adjust generation to meet whatever the demand is, whatever the load is. Now, in the future, we're going to have to instantaneously adjust load to meet whatever the generation is. So it's a radically different grid than we have seen in the past. We also have to have integration, VRE integration. So that includes everything from a cloud passing over to the solar field to gusting winds to ramp up and ramp down, frequency control, and spinning mass. Spinning mass is important because it's basically a damper on frequency, and frequency is extremely important in the operation of electronics and high-tech equipment. It doesn't matter if you're running an electric resistance heater, but that's not a very big portion of the load. Okay, so here is sort of a big picture overview of how this geothermal battery works. So we're going to start off with a sedimentary formation. It's all at one temperature, and this is the key. This is the first key point about the synthetic geothermal reservoir, is that it does not make any difference at all what the initial temperature of the rock is. So this has nothing to do with traditional geothermal. It's going to help if the rock is hot a little bit, but the basic idea here is we're going to be fluxing a huge amount of energy in and out of the rock, over daily, seasonally, for many years, for many decades, and that initial temperature has almost no relevance to the overall performance of the system. Which is really great because now huge areas across the world are now potentially geothermal. So we've just hit scalability in a way that no other geothermal technology can. All right, so we've started with the formation. So we're going to have basically two types of wells. We're going to have what are called hot wells and cold wells. Okay, very clever. The hot wells are always hot and the cold wells are always cold. And it's a double push-pull arrangement. So huff puff, however you want to phrase it. So first we're going to flow hot into the hot well, and then we're going to flow hot out of the hot well. And we're going to flow cold out of the cold well, and then we're going to flow cold, cooled geothermal fluid back into the cold well. So they're both doing this. And that has a lot of advantages actually for the performance of this overall system. So I can't remember if this is animated. All right, we'll get to that in just a second. So let's look at how this actually works. So here in the middle, we've got parabolic solar collectors, a representation of them. And so they're on an oil circuit. This is the yellow line. So we're going to be making hot oil and putting it into a heat exchanger. And now in our charging cycle, this is the dark blue and red lines. We're going to pump cold water out of the cold well through the heat exchanger to heat up that water and put it back into the hot well. Now, we can actually run a power cycle during this as well. But at this point, we're just looking at sort of the storage cycle, the storage aspects of it. So again, pump out of the cold, heat it up, put it into the hot well. The discharge cycle is exactly the opposite. We're going to flow out of the hot well and into the geothermal power block, which will, of course, cool the reservoir fluid, cool that fluid, and it will go back into the cold well. Now, almost for sure, it is going to go back into the cold well hotter than it came out on the very first cycle. So over time, this cold well will warm up, but it will always be cooler than the hot well. And so as this cold well heats up, it's going to actually help improve the overall efficiency of the cycle because we won't have to heat as far. Okay, so this is going to work great anywhere where there's sedimentary reservoir and there is permeable formation, matrix flow. So matrix flow, if there's is going to be basically interstitial flow in the rock or highly fractured rock that acts like interstitial flow. And the reason is that you want for this to work, we have to have really intimate heat contact between the water and the rock, because we're actually storing the heat not in the water. We're storing the water is just a mechanism to transfer the heat from the surface to the rock underneath. And so we need that intimate contact. So if we have a discrete fractured reservoir, what's going to happen is that we inject, that water is going to go out the fractures. And then when it comes back, it may or may not come back through those same fractures. And you may or may not get that heat back. And you're probably not going to get this kind of gradient heating. So, we're moving out, the water is cooling as it moves out, as it heats up the rock. And then when we turn the cycle around, as we pull that water in, it's going to heat up with the hottest rock next to the borehole. So it has that thermodynamic efficiency. I don't think that's going to happen in a fractured reservoir. Okay, so what about the places that don't have good solar thermal? Well, we just said there's going to be a lot of excess generation on the grid. And so perhaps there is a way to use low carbon power to charge this as well. It's not going to have very good round trip efficiency, but it's going to have better round trip efficiency than just curtailing the generation. So, and there may be some tricks we could use to improve the efficiency a little bit. But now if we can do this, now all of a sudden we're not constrained even to where there's excess to where there's a good solar thermal resource. We can basically go anywhere where there's a permeable formation and excess low carbon power. So that's really powerful. All right, so this is the configuration that is mostly studied. It's called a 5-spot. It's alternating rows of cold and hot wells offset by a half a wellbore spacing. It's called 5-spot because you've got, in this case, a quarter of 4 wells making up the supply for this one hot well. And so there's an equal amount of well for both production and injection. So the way this, and it's fairly tight spacing, 200 meters. That's one of the advantages of that matrix flow, is that you can store an amazing amount of heat in very little rock volume. So when we modeled this, it worked out that we needed about 1 well per megawatt of power plant capacity. That's just the way the math worked out. So the spacing, how far apart it is going to determine how much energy storage you can do. So if you're really just trying to cover winter, your wells may be farther apart. If you're trying to store energy on a daily basis and recover it on a daily basis, your well bores may be closer together because you don't need to store energy for as long. So here's 25 wells. It's actually 1 well pair. So this represents about 25 megawatts, more or less. So when we look at a 5-spot tile, it's symmetrical, and so we can model it with just this quarter, and actually you can go even less. You can actually model it with an eighth of the overall 5-spot. Now, to date, unfortunately, all of the reservoir modeling has been incorrect. This is not a valid model for 5-spot with a thermal resource. And the reason is that this would be valid if the volume coming out of the cold wells was the same as the volume going into the hot well, and vice versa on the discharge cycle, but it's not. The volume grows quite a bit. And so what that is going to mean is that you pull 100 cubic meters out and you put 120 cubic meters in to the same volume. That means that in this volume, there has to be a net flow out. And so if you're looking at the center, maybe that's valid, but by the time you get out here, where is that flow going to go? Well, it's got to go to the outside. And so I don't know what it's going to look like, but there are going to be streamlines that form going toward the outside. And so this is an effect that has not been modeled yet. This is my opinion. I've been unable to convince reservoir engineers that this is the case. So perhaps I'm wrong, but somebody has to explain where that extra volume is going, and I haven't heard that explanation yet. So there's more work to do here. This is the work that I was involved in was all very preliminary. It was a lot of work on a small budget, so there was a lot of gaps left in the analysis. Okay, so the way it works, just to be clear, I should have probably done this sooner. We're pulling the cold water out of the cold wells. We're heating it up with solar and putting it back into the hot wells, and then the discharge cycle is reversing that. We produce out of the hot wells, produce power from it, and re-inject the cooled fluid into the cooled wells. So again, the initial ground temperature doesn't matter. And you can see that by cycling this back and forth, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but we're going to try to go to 250 C or above. So 450 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And so, whether you start out at 70 degrees or, 300 degrees Fahrenheit, or C for that matter, well, 70 degrees C or lower, it doesn't really matter. You're going to flux so much energy through that rock that the initial temperature isn't going to matter. Okay, so there's lots of sedimentary basins. And there's various curves of porosity on the bottom, permeability on the top. Porosity is nice. It's not essential. Permeability is essential, basically, so that you can efficiently flow water into and out of the wellbore without paying a big parasitic price for friction. So we modeled in the project I was involved in. We modeled 100 millidarcies. That's clearly there's clearly much less than that, but what we're going to be looking for is probably this sort of range. And the more permeability, the better. The higher the permeability, the better. Okay, so here's our over on the right. Here's our 5-spot model. It's a quarter of a production well and a quarter of an injection well on the opposite corner from the production well. It's hard to see in this image. It's a sort of dark shading back there in the corner. Like I said, you can do an eighth of this and it's just as valid, but you can see that whatever you produced out of here and in whatever that heated up, increased in volume, came into here, that extra volume that came in, it clearly has to flow outside of this boundary. And this is the error so far in 5-spot modeling. So to make a 5-spot model successful, you basically have to put infinite acting sides on this. You block this off, but somewhere out there it has to be infinite acting, or maybe that's more on this larger scale model. So we've got two different types of model here. One is a large scale reservoir model. The other is a more focused energy flow model inside the 5-spot. So in this one, I don't remember where the wells are on it. One of these two corners, probably this one. So we're injecting here, and this is where it's important that these edges of the model be a constant pressure boundary, because as you heat up that water and inject it, that if you close these edges and try to make it a confined space, you're increasing the volume. Well, increasing the volume on an incompressible fluid drives the pressure up very fast. And so for that reason, you have to be able to let that excess volume escape out the edges. So if you are in a fully constrained reservoir, where you're changing the volume significantly, this could be a problem. You may need to figure out a pressure relief mechanism on the reservoir that you're targeting. All right, and so this graph shows the fluctuation as we're charging. This is a pure charging cycle. The blue is the charging cycle. It's an 8 hours. I think it's 8 hours charge, 16 hours rest, 8 hours charge again. So you can see that the recovery temperature is creeping up. And then I think the yellow and green lines are the discharge as we start to discharge. And we're able to maintain a fairly high temperature. We've into yet another temperature scale. So here we're working in Kelvin. And this was modeled on you can see the flow right there. Okay, so we'll move on. We also did a power in the DOE funded project with Idaho National Lab and National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. We modeled the folks in Golden created a power plant model, and we modeled what this cycle was going to look like. And we looked at a variety of different conventional geothermal power cycles. And this was a curve showing the optimization for a flash cycle, and where we ended up was a very very high flash temperature. That's just basically Carnot cycle efficiency. The higher the temperature you are at your turbine inlet, the more electricity you can generate. And so then we also optimized both the power cycle, and we also optimized how big the solar collectors are. And so what we found was that we wanted to go to about 4 times larger than the power plant capacity. So at first that doesn't really make sense, except of course that the sun isn't out for very much of the total day. And once you get into winter, it's out for even less. So basically you have to oversize the capacity of the solar field so that you can do seasonal storage. So this is a solar energy seasonal storage technology at heart. And it's going to turn diurnal and seasonal variations of solar energy collection into base load electrical power production. So, and the storage duration, we can go to at least 1,000 hours. Some other work later on indicated 3,000 or 4,000 hours. So what's interesting about that is that if you can store for that long, it really indicates that your solar resource area is much larger than what is considered to be viable solar thermal resource now, which is looked at on an annual basis. So if you've got some place that's got really long summers, summer days and short summer nights, that may not be a good solar thermal resource because of course you need that heat in the winter. But now it's entirely possible because you can store that energy in the summer and recover it in the winter. So it really changes the whole paradigm of what is viable in solar thermal. And so what we found is that as we increase the solar field size, the size of the cost of the energy that was produced went down. Now this was not the ideal power cycle. There are improvements that can be made, and those improvements will definitely drive this cost down further. But again, this was a high level, fast study, and we covered a lot of territory, I think, really well in it. My hats off to the national labs who did this great work. All right. So the competitor, of course, is theoretically electrochemical batteries. So, if you only need 4 hours, they're expensive. So it's $100 to $300 a megawatt hour for a 4-hour battery. That's just the capital cost. That does not include putting energy into it. It doesn't include the efficiency losses. It doesn't include the maintenance or degradation over time. There's quite a range, and so this is in some ways the competitor. So PV with this, but of course this is not doing seasonal storage. This is for short duration diurnal storage only. So this is a little slide that sort of shows the challenges of batteries. So this is the famous California duck curve, and it's called a duck curve because it looks like a duck. It is the net grid generation that is required after you subtract solar generation. So this gray curve is 2012, before there was very much or any solar power on the system. And then as more and more PV has been added to the system, the net load that has to be carried by other power plants has decreased in the middle of the day. But as you can see, out when it's dark, the load has been continuing to increase. So adding this solar has not done anything for the peak. The peak has continued to grow, and solar is not able to address that. It also creates this big ramp So in this example, we've got 14,000 megawatts in about 4 hours. This is the territory of gas turbines. And so we talked about the grid perspective. Well, you know, sure, the PV is zero emissions, but the gas turbines that allow the PV to be on the grid are not zero emissions. So this is why it's really important to look at the grid as a whole when looking at power technologies, and why geothermal is so much. So geothermal shows up in these kind of curves as just a thin band in all hours. It never changes. So that's that's not so useful for following load curves, but down here below the belly, it is very useful, and it contributes in a very meaningful way. The duck curve is always shown for March 31st also. I don't know why. I wish they would do the same thing for July 31st and December 31st. But anyway, they don't. California does not publish those very often. So let's take a look at the battery. So if we add a 4-hour battery that's been charged by solar, and we'll use it to cut this peak, here's 4 hours, this little red arrow. It only has to provide it at the peak this much power, and the energy that it has to provide is the area under the curve. And so I looked at that very quickly and said, okay, well, that looks like about 2.5 gigawatts of capacity that we have to have for solar to be able to address this peak area here. And we're going to need about 8 gigawatt hours based on this being 80% of the area. But now that I look at it again, I think I way overestimated that. I'd say we're maybe 50 or 60% of this block is actually being served by the battery. So it would actually only be like 6 gigawatt hours. So now we say, okay, I'm going to add another 4 hours so that I don't have to have something to cover it. So now I've got to cover this whole area. So now to add the next 4 hours of battery, I have to have 5.5 gigawatts of capacity. And here I estimated it at about 70% of the area. So I have to have about 30 gigawatt hours. So the first 4 batteries, well, maybe we can afford that. The next 4 hours got really, really expensive. And this is the challenge with batteries, is that the longer you want the batteries to cover, the more and more energy you have to. So the cost is driven by these two factors. What's the peak power you have to deliver, and how much total energy do you have to deliver? And the total energy is actually the most expensive part. Okay, so the labs did a comparison of a synthetic geothermal reservoir with an electrochemical battery. So storage duration, 1,000 hours versus 4 to 8 hours. All night, every night, yes. All winter long, yes. Do you have to have cheap external grid power? We were studying a solar collector system, no. Delivered energy, $130 a megawatt hour versus $148 a megawatt hour on an annual basis. So all of a sudden, according to this calculation, geothermal is cheaper than PV and battery. So, and we have to have a gas turbine to back this up. And we'll see a slide a little bit later as to why that is. So we have to have that with PV and battery. We do not have to have that with geothermal. So basically, we have huge advantages in pretty much every category of a synthetic geothermal reservoir over PV plus an electrochemical battery. Okay, so drilling. So I'm going to go through a couple of different ideas that came about after the INL NREL study funded by the Geothermal Technology Office at DOE. So this is one concept. It's 4 small hot injectors. This is basically built around the idea that you can drill slim holes much cheaper than you can drill large diameter holes. So we're going to drill in this concept, it's 8 little slim holes and to do the charging cycle, and 1 large producer to do the discharging cycle with the flow then going back to the 4 small ones. This is one idea. It's not my favorite, but I'm presenting it to just show that there's a variety. Now, I think what is interesting is to come back and say, rather than this being, so this would take the place of 1 5-spot. And so here's the way it would work. Very similar in a conventional geothermal power plant. So here's a 36 megawatt configuration, 9 wells, 9 wells per megawatt, 320 wells. So here's a 650 megawatt installation. So one of the principles that we went about with this is, who cares about 20 or 30 megawatts? This is only worth pursuing at really big scale. So, you know, we're trying to think a lot big. How do you make this really big? And so here's a so I'm using sort of a 650 megawatt capacity. So basically the size of 1 smallish nuke plant. So here's the 5-spot concept. We've already talked about this on the left. Here's what it looks like. You know, the geothermal power plants are distributed, you know, over a fairly large area. I want you to contemplate all of the piping that is required with this one and with this one. Even more so with this one, right? Got to connect 9 wells for each of those dots in the 650. So let's think back to SAGD. And of course, fracking. And so we've got, we can do horizontal wells in permeable sandstone formations. Yes, we can do that, to quote Paul Thompson of Ormat. And here's what it looks like in shale gas. A company called Dawson Energy Advisors, I found their image on the internet and borrowed it. So credit to Dawson Energy. Look them up if you need fracking help, I guess is the plug for them. So in this case, we're looking at sort of 4 wellheads, 12 wellheads, or something like that, perhaps. And we're getting 48 kilometers of in the reservoir. With 4 geothermal power plants. So now think about the piping arrangements so 400 to 600 megawatt installation, revenue, you know, a few $100 million a year. Now this is the kind of scale, this is the core technology of oil and gas majors. This is why this is a fascinating concept to me for the majors to be in. They can do this. And they don't have to be involved in the power plant. So power plant companies, utilities are more than happy to own the power plants on the surface. Their expertise is large surface investments in power plants at low rates of return. They have no interest in everything below surface. And that's almost the inverse of what E&P companies are about. So I think there's a fit, there's an economic and expertise fit here. So, you know, here's what perhaps the wellhead looks like. If you can do multilaterals, or maybe you have to have 12 of them. I don't know. I don't know how it works, and how this would be arranged. Nobody's really studied this yet, to my knowledge. I guess they're doing something like this at Deep in Saskatchewan. We've heard talk of these kind of wells costing $1 million to put them in uncased, $1 million each or less. If you're doing this kind of bulk drilling all at once. So, you know, and there is a chance that you're going to get trace hydrocarbons. This is incredibly valuable from an NPV basis. even if it only lasts a few years, or even if it only lasts a year, that surge of cash at the front is going to make a huge difference in the economics. So yeah, there's some concepts out here. I mean, there's even a melded one where we take sort of this concept and horizontal drilling, and we basically have a big production pad that has radial wells going all the way around, and then we have maybe 4 injection pads around the outside with horizontal wells interspersed. So I think that there's a lot of work that could be done in optimizing the reservoir configuration, and I think it's got good. It seems like it's all well within core competencies. This is not new technology. It's just the reapplication of existing technology. So renewable energy heat sources. So we are not going to talk about photovoltaics. More on this in a bit. I'm not sure if this is, so what we are talking about is concentrating solar. It comes in a variety of flavors, from linear Fresnel, parabolic trough, central tower. So all of these are enormous footprints. Solar energy is a very diffuse energy source. I mean, here's some people, in this central tower that's in China. I don't know if you've ever seen, it's over here, this sort of bluish thing over here to the right of the tower. That's the air-cooled condenser. On a conventional steam power plant, that would be by far the biggest piece of equipment visible. It would dwarf everything else. And here, you can hardly see it. So solar, no matter which way you go, you're going to need a lot of land area. I think this one, okay, so I chose September, and I chose September because this idea of, everybody knows that the red area is where the best solar is. But the question with geotest, well, it's also called geotest. Geotest, which is geologic thermal energy storage, synthetic geothermal reservoir, geothermal battery, all interchangeable. Everybody knows the solar's down here, but with this synthetic geothermal reservoir, the question is there enough solar here through the summer? So we're decent in September. We're very good out here in July, August, June, probably. So is there enough here to do a significant solar resource out here? I don't know, maybe. It's worth thinking about, because certainly nobody is thinking that this is solar thermal technology territory right now, because there's very poor solar out there in the winter. Oh yeah, so there's August. So, looks a lot better, a lot more promising perspective. So yeah, April, July, September. So again, the idea that there is excellent solar over a much larger area. So solar is one option. Oh, so the other option, sorry, I didn't know where we were going with this one. Renewable electric power is the other. So we've mentioned that already. So let's dig into that. So we have huge wind resources. So this white box is exactly the same on these two slides. And I'm looking, the yellow star is, it's somewhere in Oklahoma where there's lots of oil and gas operations. So let's take a look at what that means. And so the thing to remember about wind is that a wind power is proportional to speed cubed. So someplace that has 10 miles per hour isn't twice as good as someplace that's 5 miles per hour or meters per second or whatever. It's it's 8 times better. And so, you know, these little blue spots over here in Wyoming, those are incredible wind resources. And so, you know, if you build here, which is probably where they're building wind in Wyoming right now, you're going to end up, you're almost certainly going to end up with excess power. You don't need as much power at night as you do in the day. You don't need as much in spring as you do in the summer. So whenever you put in massive wind, you're going to have excess power. And so you've got wires that can move that power around. And so this is the opportunity. So here's an example. Oh, it's Bartlesville, Oklahoma. So it's windy in the spring. It's not windy in the summer. Bartlesville, I can guarantee you, is a summer peaking electric utility. So, you know, the question is, so, you know, we're at, you know, we've got 20, this is the average, 25%, 10%. So 10%, 10% of the time we're at least 16 miles per hour versus in the summer we're at 10. So that those two cubed is what the difference in power is going to be between spring and here. Well, you know, this is going to limit how much wind you can put in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, because you need the power here and you don't need it here. Okay, so now the synthetic geothermal reservoir steps in. And we can store this excess wind here in the ground and produce it as geothermal power in the summer when it's needed. So that's, and this is unfortunately probably not going to be a very high efficiency round trip. But if it allows more wind to be built, then that's something that's could be potentially very valuable. I'm assuming that we're only going to get a 20% round trip efficiency starting with electricity. Maybe we could get up to 30% if we do some clever things, but you know, it's not going to be high efficiency. So nuclear power plants, you know, a little story about me is that in college, I was dead set against nukes. This guy over here, I fought it tooth and nail in college, Diablo Canyon. And well, not tooth and nail, I wasn't that committed, but I was definitely opposed to it. And now they're shutting it down. And I think it's the biggest mistake California could make, in my opinion. 24/7 zero carbon power. So anyway, if nuclear is going to be in the future mix, which I think it's going to have to be, there's just not solar and wind that are going to cover electric load up here in region 3. You're going to have something that's on all the time in the winter, and that's going to be nuke. Well, if you build out for winter with nukes up here, you're going to have excess power in the springtime and fall, without a doubt, and probably the summer too. So, so again, you know, looking forward toward decarbonization, you know, this could be a way to allow more nukes to be built. So, why does it allow more nukes? Because a nuke is very expensive to build and very inexpensive to operate. And so, but if you have to shut it down and you don't amortize those costs, then they become prohibitively expensive, even more prohibitively expensive. So if you can make use of that power, even at a low round trip efficiency, then that may open the potential for more deployment of economical nuclear power. I think what's interesting is to think about some high nuclear countries like France, which may already be in this situation. So should Total be looking at synthetic geothermal reservoir to store excess French nuclear power if it exists? I don't know. Maybe it exists. Maybe France, they've got a very strong nuclear program. Maybe they can afford to build more nuclear if they've got some place to put more power. So I think there's think Total is a really interesting one to talk to about synthetic geothermal reservoir. So photovoltaics, I guess we're going to get to this now. Oh, right. So photovoltaics, excess power. That's why we're going to get to it later. So here's another view of California's duct curve, except now you'll notice where 0 is. So here's the green band that's geothermal. Well, it's kind of nice. 24/7, 365, it looks exactly the same. So what this is showing us in California, and I guess I need to wrap this up, is that California is putting in so much PV that they're going to end up with 15,000 megawatts of excess capacity that has to be curtailed. And this is 15,000 megawatts beyond 100% of their export capacity. So 100% of their load and 100% of their export capacity, and they're still going to have to curtail 15,000 megawatts at peak hour and about 75 gigawatt hours a day, 75,000 megawatt hours per day in the spring. Well, that is going to be curtailed. So what's the value of that power? Is 0. So there is potentially, even with solar power, there is potentially a way to make use of that excess electricity to cover. Here's the classic problem with wind and solar. Here it is in a typical day. And here it is a 3-day period in January. This actually happens every few years, where the capacity basically goes to almost nothing, and the energy output the same. And so what does that mean? It means that you have to have gas turbines out there on the grid somewhere. And so, rather than having gas turbines, why not have a synthetic geothermal power plant? Sorry, this is, so I'm going to speed along. There's our opportunities for seasonal arbitration. Here's arbitrage, I mean. The green is low price power in the late spring. And here's the delivered value of power. So we've got lots of areas that are 5 to 15 and lots that are 25 to 100. So even a 20% round trip efficiency is a moneymaker, right? That's somewhere between, well, it's in that range of where it could be economical. So this is it, 4 or 5 to 1 return. In the interest of time, I'm going to, this is another nice thing here at so what about getting the heat into the ground? There's some points here that are interesting. So when we can consume huge amounts of power all day, every day for days on end, there's no other storage technology that can do that. That's unlimited in its capacity. How are we doing it? We're doing it with resistance water heaters. Well, that's pretty cheap energy conversion technology. And the geology doesn't have to co-locate with the renewable energy. So you can generate in the Mojave Desert and store in Northern California. You can generate in Wyoming and store in Oklahoma. So yeah, we can do this. So I think there's work on power cycle optimization. Maybe should we keep going a little bit late, or do you want me to break it off here? I don't know how long we are on our time so far.
Kevin, we can go another 5-10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so there's a different, so this is the basic idea again. So we're pulling from the cold well, we pump it out, we put it into the hot reservoir, and we're keeping the water as a liquid, not as steam. I did a quick calculation about using steam, and although it carries a lot more energy, it has a lot more specific volume. And so that means that you've got more pressure drop in the reservoir, getting it out away from the well bore. And because it has so much volume, you're going to heat up a lot more. The same amount of energy is going to heat up a lot more rock. and then it's going to condense and change phase. And now it's going to, I think the geochemistry, the risk of scaling in the reservoir and losing permeability is high. So I'm not really convinced that steam is the way to go, but I don't have expertise in steam flood. So there may be people who have that expertise who could address whether it's better to inject steam or hot water. But for now, we've only looked at injecting hot water. So perhaps we have to, because we're going to cool this off, we're probably going to need or we're going to heat it up. We're going to the calcium minerals are retrograde solubility, so they scale when they heat up instead of scale when they cool down. So we're going to need a calcium inhibitor going into, perhaps need a calcium inhibitor in the charging cycle. The recovery is just through a conventional geothermal power plant. Everybody loves Icelandic power plants because they're so photogenic. I doubt we're going to find any. I don't know how much permeable formation we're going to find down there, but our goal here to minimize risk to the reservoir is to boil in the wellbore, not in the formation. Now, because we have to put energy in at so much higher a rate than we're going to take it out, that actually helps us because now we can operate at pretty high wellhead pressures. And what high wellhead pressures means high temperature. High temperature means better conversion efficiency. And it also means that the water is not going to boil until it's well up the wellbore and away from the formation. So it all works together quite well from that perspective. And we're going to end up, I think the rough calculation is 25% steam at the power plant. The reason we're confining ourselves to flashing, to producing steam at the surface is that at the temperatures we're going to, it's unlikely that we will have reliable pumps. So this is something that can be revisited for sure. But I would say that at 250 C, we're beyond the range of submersible pumps. I don't think we're going to do, that's not actually the cooling tower, but I don't think we're going to want to use an evaporative cooling tower. We're going to want to do dry cooling. This hasn't been done in geothermal, but I was involved in a project that designed a very successful, that designed a successful and affordable dry cold steam condenser. So that's an option for us. We can also do hybrid. So again, we're going to have, so this is 330 megawatts of steam power plant in the big building, binary power plants being air cooled here. So this is another example of how you can do dry cooling with a combination of steam and ORC. And this is a completely commercial technology. So 100% reinjection here. So, this is, again, we're not trying to really break new ground here. We're just taking technologies that are here, and here, and that have never been bolted together, and we're just going to try to bolt them together. Horizontal drilling, steam flood, and geothermal power production, solar collectors. So here's a single pressure steam turbine. Here's we can take the separated hot water or and do binary with it. Here's a 2-pressure steam turbine. This turned out to be in the modeling that the National Renewable Energy Lab did, NREL did. This turned out to be the most cost-effective solution with our very primitive economics. So again, this is area that needs additional work. So a lot of people say, well, the reservoir temperature is going to change over time. This really isn't a problem for geothermal. Geothermal does this all the time. Every geothermal field declines with time, and we have ways of dealing with that. And we can deal with it even, so we can take those same technologies that tend to occur over long periods of time, and we can adapt them to deal with either daily or more likely seasonal changes in the temperatures that are flowing to the power plant. And basically, most geothermal power plants, they just need an energy flow, not a design condition. So if your temperature drops, you just put more energy in and the power plant still runs at full capacity. So, so I'm not worried about that. This is easily handled, and this can be easily handled. So the factors, high cost of heat means that cycle efficiency is valuable. The wells are expensive, so that tends to reduce cycle efficiency because you want to drill less wells and you're willing to take a efficiency hit to do so. A large solar field allows the plants to run more. It also increases the number of wells, but that has the benefit of increasing cycle efficiency. So you can see we're starting to get fairly complicated on the techno-economic analysis. The hotter the water we inject, that improves the cycle efficiency, but it also increases the cost of the wells. One way to do a lot of this is to simply add a steam topping cycle. So this, we're going, instead of trying to produce water directly from the solar thermal collectors at 250 C, we're going to try to produce fluid at 400 C, and then create a small steam turbine that lowers that energy from 400 C to 250 C range in order to heat up the water. And this is going to be a much more thermodynamically efficient cycle. This is not an expensive turbine, and I'm hoping, no. So you saw how big that turbine was a couple slides up. A high pressure steam turbine like this is a tiny fraction of that total steam size on a pound size per megawatt basis. So this is not a very expensive turbine. Okay, so why does it fit the oil and gas industry? Lots of drilling at low cost and sedimentary formations, check. Reservoir characterization, 3D exploration, modeling, geochemistry, yeah, check, check, check. Ownership of power generation, low ROI with long payback. Yeah, it's not really a fit, but we've sort of already talked about why that's not a problem. For a utility partner, that's exactly what their business model is. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways that this could be structured, but the important message here is that there is a fit. This is what this company does. This is what that company does. So that's the making of a business arrangement. And here's that what it is. Here's one idea. You know, the utility buys in once the field has been developed and tested and proven, and maybe you know, and of course, you know, the power company the oil and gas industry could basically have some revenue sharing off of the generation as well. So there's deals here to be made, I feel like. So let's wrap it up. High temperature geochemistry and geology. So the commercialization work is in really looking at chemistry and additives, stresses of mineralogy, kinetics of the scale. Interestingly, Idaho National Lab has been doing that for the last year. They just published a couple of papers in the Geothermal Resources or Geothermal Rising Conference papers. I haven't read them myself. I saw a couple of presentations. Really excellent work. And they were working with nasty fluids, and they still showed that it was viable to do this at 250 C. So I'm really pleased. They've really advanced this a lot, I think. Reservoir modeling, nobody's really gone multi-year, non-homogeneous reservoir, either multi-year or non-homogeneous reservoirs. Drilling and well completions, getting back to, well, which arrangement is the best? How much does it actually cost to drill these wells? What's the cyclic effect? There's a woman named Tatiana at Oak Ridge. She's an expert on cement. I talked to her about this idea. And when she talks about high temperature thermal cycling, she's talking about hot to cold, not warm to hot, or hot to hotter, hot to hotter, hot to hotter. She wasn't too worried about that. So we may not have an issue here. Apparently my warranties have all worn out at the same time. Sorry about that. So power cycle, there's some work to be done here, especially the steam topping cycle, off design modeling. So what happens is you get toward the end of seasonal storage, that temperature starts dropping off, or it's a cloudy day, you don't collect as much heat. What do you do with it? How do you manage that? So there's work to be done here for sure. And economics, including both grid level analysis and financial structures and partnerships. So this is what we were doing for RPE. I should probably not have covered that one. And so that is the presentation on the synthetic geothermal reservoir.
Yeah, very nice, Kevin. A lot of information and opportunities on this. So let's see if anybody has any questions.
Let me hang on just a second, unfortunately.
I'm going to stop the recording.